Thanks, Jacob. So first of all, just thanks to Jacob. Thanks for Energy Council of Canada for pulling together this event. I'm really looking forward to it. Um, I think it's fair to say that many of us presenting here today are going to have very different perspectives on what the future of energy looks like in Canada, but ultimately we share a common goal, which is broadly affordable, sustainable access to energy for all Canadians, and making sure that we in Canada use our talent and our resources to grow an economy and build good jobs. So whatever that energy future looks like, we're all working towards something that looks very similar. So I'll take these 15 minutes to talk through what 2020 looked like for the nuclear sector, and then I'm going to close with a few thoughts about what comes next. So Jacob started with a few words about crisis and the idea of a perma-crisis. I've got a few thoughts on this as well, because it feels like in the last few years, each crisis has compounded the last one. And this all came to a head in 2022. So, whether that's climate change, the pandemic, or the energy crisis resulting from the invasion of Ukraine, we're all feeling the effects of crisis in some form. And no energy industry has been left untouched by these crises. It could be supply chain disruptions, fuel price volatility, rising interest rates, inconsistent government policy, whatever it might be. But for the nuclear industry, the impact of these crises, and very specifically the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine, has perhaps been the most unique. Not to say that we are unique in being impacted, but the way in which it's impacted our industry has been unique. Because over the course of 2022, the public and political perception of nuclear, it changed dramatically. So countries that had for decades been, taking for granted the idea that there would always be affordable, predictable supply of energy, that all changed very quickly last February. And in the face of that energy supply insecurity, governments were looking for a stable, predictable, and domestically secure supply of energy. And here echoing some of the comments that Paul made on reshoring. And that means that many have turned again to nuclear power. So countries with established nuclear industries like the US, UK, France, Japan have recognized that their existing nuclear fleets provide them with a major strategic advantage in terms of lowering emissions while maintaining energy security. Other countries that are looking to enter the nuclear industry to reduce their reliance on Russia, and here we're talking about some countries in Eastern Europe, are looking at options there. And then even jurisdictions that were planning on phasing out nuclear entirely, such as California and South Korea, are actually extending the life of their existing plants. And what we're seeing in Canada is similar, growing strong public support for the role of nuclear in the country's energy transition. So if you look at polls, averaging between 60 and 70% of Canadians support or strongly support the role of nuclear in the energy transition. And these are not just polls run by the nuclear industry, but also independent polls as well. And we consistently see greater support among Canadians who know more about the industry. So as people become more educated about the Canadian nuclear industry's safety record and what it contributes to the country in terms of not only energy security and economic growth, but also emissions reductions, then support actually grows. But prior to 2022, the federal government hadn't been very vocal in its support of nuclear. Even so far as at COP26, when Justin Trudeau even mentioned the word nuclear, that was seen as a big win. But then last year, everything really changed. And it began with the federal budget in March 2022, where we saw actual dollars being spent on ensuring that the future of small modular reactors, or SMRs in Canada, would succeed. And it really showed to us that the federal government was committed to nuclear being a part of this shift towards a net zero economy. And it was actually the first documented government policy that provided financial support for SMRs, specifically as a solution for climate change. So quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the nuclear industry, an SMR, small modular reactor, is a nuclear reactor that is significantly smaller than conventional power plants. So we're talking about 300 megawatts or smaller. So they're roughly 2 to 3 times smaller than a conventional CANDU reactor that we have in Canada. And while small reactors have been used around the world for decades, if you think about nuclear submarines in the military, for example, the push to commercialize this technology is relatively new. And the momentum around SMRs in Canada has been growing pretty steadily over recent years. We have the 2018 SMR Roadmap, 2021 SMR Action Plan, and then last year, we saw 4 provinces, that's Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, came together with a strategic plan for the deployment of SMRs. So I'll talk briefly about each of these provinces. Now, each of them is in a different phase of how they're approaching the future of nuclear. Alberta is really just at the beginning, considering the possibility of building out a nuclear sector. Saskatchewan has a long history of being involved in nuclear due to the uranium industry, but it's now really beginning the process of deciding whether or not it wants to produce nuclear power. And obviously, Ontario and New Brunswick have been in nuclear for a very long time, and they're looking at moving ahead with very specific new SMR projects. So in Ontario, last year, the SMR project in Darlington took a big step forward. This was announced, the project itself was announced at the end of 2021, but by the end of 2022, we're seeing actual shovels in the ground, site preparation, and getting the site ready for the SMR that we expect to be built tentatively around 2028, subject to the licensing process, which we expect to be finished around 2024. So this SMR being developed at Darlington is a GE Hitachi BWRX-300. I'm going to just focus on it because you'll probably hear a lot about it in the coming years. So it's not just a fancy set of letters. BWR stands for boiling water reactor. So this is a type of reactor that's been used for a very long time in the nuclear industry, over 60 years. The X is not just something exciting. It actually signifies it's the 10th in the series of boiling water reactors developed by General Electric. The first one coming out in 1955, so this is absolutely established technology, and 300 simply stands for 300 megawatts. So the reason that the BWRX-300 is exciting is because, yes, it's established technology, so there's a lot of people who know how all of this works, but at the same time, the idea of building it small and building it in a way that can be modularized is exciting. And that brings me to Saskatchewan, which last year announced also that it's pursuing the possibility of building one of these same SMRs in the province in the early to mid 2030s. And they've chosen 2 potential sites, which they announced middle of last year, one at Estevan and one at Elbow. And so they're going to continue work on environmental social impact assessments at both sites, engagement with local stakeholders, obviously engagement with local Indigenous groups. But a final decision on whether or not, honestly, they will build an SMR and where won't be made till 2029. So it's a very long process to make sure that there is support both in the province generally and very much in the host community. Moving over to New Brunswick. New Brunswick, there are 2 SMR projects already underway. One is the ARC-100, which is developed by ARC Clean Energy. This is a liquid sodium cooled fast reactor designed to use its own waste. And then Moltex Energy is also aiming to deploy a 300 megawatt waste burner reactor in the early 2030s. And so this is a fast reactor that actually could use used CANDU fuel as its fuel, which is an exciting possibility. And then also, no, I'll come back to New Brunswick in a moment. So what does that mean for Canada and the industry? Honestly, Canada's positioning itself as a world leader when it comes to SMRs, and that's really exciting for us. So once the SMR at Darlington is complete, this will be the first grid-connected SMR in the G7. So there have been other designs that have been deployed, not necessarily to the grid in Russia and China, but this will be the first one, commercial deployment of an SMR. And SMRs aren't only for the grid. I know we've had discussions with several people who are presenting today about the potential for SMRs in industry and in the production of hydrogen. So there were some interesting announcements last year. OPG and X Energy signed a framework agreement to pursue opportunities for the X Energy reactor. This is called the XE100 for industrial applications in Ontario and across Canada. And in New Brunswick, the Belledune Port Authority announced plans to build an ARC-100 to support their industry site. So we're really seeing a couple of streams of SMR development in Canada, both for electricity generation and for high temperature heat and electricity generation for industry. So a lot of momentum, a lot happening, but we need to talk about investment because the big question is where's the money coming from? How are these things getting built, right? We had a lot of support from the federal government over the past couple of years, and some big announcements last year. So we'll talk about public investment first. First of all, the Strategic Innovation Fund. There were announcements for a few different projects: the Westinghouse eVinci microreactor, the Moltex waste burner that I mentioned, and then Terrestrial Energy's integral molten salt reactor. And so these were, relatively speaking, small amounts from SIF that enabled the deployment of essentially prototyping projects. But then the big announcement, which came in October 2022, was the $970 million loan from Canada Infrastructure Bank for the development of that SMR at Darlington, which, as you know, is one of the largest funding commitments for energy infrastructure in recent years. So, this kind of government support is really sending a signal to private investors that Canada is committed to a technology over the long term. Signals that Canada is going to ensure the policy stability that is necessary to protect its own public investment and therefore make private investment much more likely. So speaking of private investment, the big news in the nuclear industry last year was the acquisition by Cameco of a 49% stake in Westinghouse. So for those of you who don't know the significance of this, Cameco is a Canadian mining company, the world's second largest producer of uranium. And Westinghouse is a major global supplier of nuclear technology. But then the other 51% of that purchase was made by Brookfield Renewable, which is one of the world's largest investors in clean energy. They have about 125 gigawatts of clean energy capacity, either in operation or development worldwide. So, that really sent a signal that from the perspective of private investors, nuclear is clean energy. They're seeing nuclear as part of that clean energy portfolio and something that is worth investing in with private money. So I've taken a lot of time talking about SMRs, but none of this would be possible without the existing CANDU nuclear fleet. So again, just background for those of you who don't really follow the nuclear industry. There are currently 4 nuclear generating stations in Canada, 3 in Ontario, 1 in New Brunswick. And these 4 stations are made up of 19 reactors. These stations produce about 15% of the country's electricity, 60% of the electricity in Ontario. And over the past few years, 2 of these plants, this is at Darlington, run by OPG, and then at Bruce Power, have been undergoing refurbishment activities that will enable them to run for another 30 to 35 years. And this is echoed across industries in other countries in the US and in Europe, seeing long-term operation of existing nuclear plants as a very cost-effective way to ensure low carbon power in the future. So these refurbishments are both on time and on budget. Well, actually under budget in both cases, which is something we really like to highlight because one of the main media talking points on nuclear is that it takes too long and costs too much. And in Canada, we're really showing this is no longer the case. And they're actually increasing output. By the time the Bruce refurbishment is over, it will have added the equivalent of 1 additional large reactor to the site just through increasing efficiencies from the refurbishment and new technologies. The 3rd plant in Ontario, which is at Pickering, it was set to close in 2025. This was extended to 2026. And there's a study underway to determine if it's economically and technically feasible to refurbish Pickering as well. And we expect the results of that study later this year. So I'll take a moment to note that the ISO in Ontario released their Pathways to Decarbonization report at the end of last year, where they projected the need for an additional 18 gigawatts of nuclear. This is new nuclear by 2050. So all that to say, there's a lot of excitement around SMRs, but this is not the last time that we'll be talking about large nuclear in Canada. Finally, I should touch upon nuclear waste because it's a question that comes up often for people, more so for people who aren't involved in the industry. So just to say that this is a topic that is taken very seriously, but at the same time, within the industry, we like to say that nuclear waste is actually a good news story. As nuclear is the only industry that actually fully accounts for, pays for, plans for the long-term management and storage of its waste and the very little amount of it that there is. So there weren't major announcements last year in terms of the waste plan. The final siting decision for the Deep Geologic Repository, which is being managed by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, has been pushed to early 2024, but construction is still slated to begin in the 2030s and operation in the 2040s. And this is following international best practice. And once it begins, Canada would be at the forefront of nuclear waste management, also creating a significant number of jobs and economic opportunities. So a few final words and next steps. The focus for the nuclear industry in 2023 and in the years ahead will be honestly in fulfilling the promises that we've made. You know, the nuclear industry likes to talk a big game about delivering low carbon affordable power. And SMRs have been in discussion for a long time, and really we're entering the phase of getting these things built on time and on budget and delivering. But that's going to require a few things. And I'm going to close with three main points I want to make. So first, you know, we're going to keep pushing for nuclear to be able to compete on a level playing field with other clean energy technologies. And so a lot of our policy and advocacy work in the past weeks and months has been on ensuring that the newly announced Clean Energy Investment Tax Credit can be fairly applied across the clean energy technology space. And so right now, as announced, that's specifically included for SMRs, but could not be applied to Crown utilities, which obviously makes up the majority of the nuclear sector, could not be applied to large nuclear, and could not be applied to, frankly, any energy infrastructure projects that have very long lead times and construction timelines. So we see this as a weakness of this tax credit policy and something that we're working on. Second, and I imagine this will come up in many discussions today, we have to recognize that in Canada, it just takes far too long to build any kind of energy infrastructure. Now, none of us are going to argue with the need to ensure safety, protect the environment, fully respect the rights of all partners, community stakeholders. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that the energy transition and Canada's energy goals can't succeed on these existing timelines. And so this is something that the nuclear industry will be looking at very closely, and I expect many of us here will be looking at closely. Which brings us to my third point, which is that Canada's energy transition requires cooperation. So that means continuing to work together across industries. So nuclear, hydrogen, renewables, oil and gas. There's no path to net zero without all energy technologies playing a role. You know, we believe this fundamentally. And this means there are vast opportunities for our industries to work together and create synergies. So I make this last point because today's event is an important example of the kind of dialogue, information sharing that is necessary for this country to succeed in reaching its goals, and I hope to see more of it. As I said, there's no single technology or industry that can enable successful energy transition in Canada. It's going to take all of us. That's the message that we brought to COP27 last year when the nuclear industry went there, and that's the message we're going to continue to bring in the future. So, you know, with that in mind, I look forward to hearing from the other participants and learning about the other energy industries in Canada, and I hope we can all continue to work closely. Thanks, Jacob.